Hi, my name is Shanice Anderson, and I'm a student here in the History Department at Liberty University. And today I'm going to discuss how to create a lesson that engages students at a history museum. Whether or not your historical profession is that as a museum educator or a classroom educator, my hope is that you find some value in the information I'm presenting, as it really is designed to help engage learners as they move throughout historical museums. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. The main benefits of lesson planning is that students are able to develop certain skills such as vocabulary acquisition, analytical thinking, literacy skills such as listening, reading, writing, and speaking, observational skills, so understanding how to interact with different artifacts and examine them through a critical lens, and then inquiry based learning skills, so learning how to answer questions and even ask questions related to the content in the museum. The format of this lecture has four different parts. First, there will be a learning opportunity while I present information, and then we will pause for a moment and then engage in the assessment opportunity, and then finally, we will reflect on our learning. The main benefits of lesson planning is that students are able to develop certain skills such as vocabulary acquisition, analytical thinking, literacy skills such as listening, reading, writing, and speaking, observational skills, so understanding how to interact with different artifacts and examine them through a critical lens, and then inquiry based learning skills, so learning how to answer questions and even ask questions related to the content in the museum. The format of this lecture has four different parts. First, there will be a learning opportunity while I present information, and then we will pause for a moment and then engage in the assessment opportunity, and then finally, we will reflect on our learning. Pause for a moment and scan the QR code at the bottom of the page or click the link to access the History Museum Lesson Plan template. We'll be working with this throughout the presentation, so you want to make sure that you have access to it either on a phone, tablet, or a computer that's separate from the presentation we're viewing. You will want to make a copy for editing purposes. And then, of course, if there are any thoughts or questions that you have as you review the lesson plan, write those down in the notes section of the document, as they may be answered later on in the presentation. Okay, so the first thing we want to do before actually developing the lesson is planning the museum visit. And there are several key things that you want to look for when planning a visit. So the first is the standard. So what should learners actually know? You want to create a learning target. So what should learners be able to do by the end of their museum visit? And more often than not, that's written as an I can statement. From there, once you have the standard and learning target, you can select a museum location that's related to your content. And then you can begin planning the visit. So when will you visit the museum? Will it be during the summer months, the winter months, while school is in session? Will it be early in the morning or the afternoon? These are going to be really important things to consider. Then, of course, you want to develop a list of questions to ask the museum coordinator, such as can students touch the artifacts, or are there any special collections or exhibits? Do the museums offer discounts? And are there any hands on learning opportunities? And here's my example here. You'll see that I chose one of the 8th grade Georgia Studies standards that talks about the role of individuals in the civil rights movement, and my learning target reflects that standard. Again, those serve as the structure for the museum visit, and it helps you figure out what type of museum you need to visit. We chose to visit the National Center for Civil and Human Rights here in Atlanta, and I chose a summer date from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. And then I wrote down 3 questions that I could potentially ask museum coordinators once I reach out. And so now we're going to pause again, and I want you to complete these sections of the History Museum lesson template. So the first thing you need to do is search a local school district's websites for social studies academic standards. And then once you have the standard, develop an I can statement so that your learners have a goal. From there, you can find a museum that aligns with your standard. And then finally, schedule a visit date and time. So check the museum hours and then develop a list of questions to possibly ask the museum's visitation coordinators. Next part of lesson planning is understanding key vocabulary. As a history educator, there are going to be several pieces of vocabulary that you are going to need to know in order to create an engaging experience for your students. And those words are annuals, archive, curator, museum, social studies, history, historical, and exhibition. Now, most social studies educators and historians know these words. However, if you don't, I'd like you to take a moment and pause again and either click on the Quizlet link or scan the QR code to get some practice in on Quizlet so that you can master each of the terms. Once you feel like you've mastered the terms, feel free to unpause the video and move on to the next section. With you all is how to develop higher order thinking questions for your learners. Of course, we know that when students are able to ask and answer questions, it drives and supports their learning. And when those questions occur in a higher order thinking format, their engagement is increased along with their critical thinking skills and ability to retain information. And those questions typically appear in a scaffolded manner, meaning they go from easiest to hardest. And they start with level 1 questions, which are factual, and then gradually move into level 2 questions, which asks them to make predictions. And then in level 3, we start to see some of that higher order thinking with analytical questions. And then finally in level 4, we start to see the highest levels of thinking and complexity with synthesis questions. And so here's a tool called the Question Development Matrix that we'll be using for the next few minutes. And it essentially helps us develop questions in a way that challenges students based on their questioning and answering level. And so we start here with the root word on the left side of the screen. And so you can look at who, what, where, when, why, and how. And these are all words that we use to begin questions. And then here you have words across the top that serve as the difference between, let's say, a level 1 question and a level 3 question. And they actually challenge the students in a way that, again, allows them to scaffold their learning. Okay, so the way this works is you start over here on the left side, and then as you drag your mouse across the screen, you'll find that the questions will increase in complexity. So let's look, for example, at when is. You'll notice that it falls into this gray box here, this factual box, and so that would be considered a level 1 question. However, if we did how would, we would see that that falls in a level 4 synthesis box. And here's my example here. So I went ahead and developed 4 questions related to the standard that we're covering. Now you're going to do the exact same thing. So we're going to pause the video again, and I want you to click on this link right here to access the question develop matrix. If you need to see it larger than it is on lesson plan, that's what that link is there for. And I want you to go ahead and develop 4 questions, 1 from each tier. And if you would like to do an extension, develop 3 additional higher order thinking questions from level 3 or 4. Once you're done developing your questions, feel free to play the video again to move on to the next portion of the lecture. So now that you've created your higher order thinking questions, it's time to start developing the activity that students will complete as they venture around the museum. And so there are several things that you want to take into consideration. One is to select an exhibit. So museums can be very large places, and so you want to focus on a specific portion of the museum that's aligned to what students are learning. You also want to decide how learners will engage with peers, and this kind of depends on your group size and abilities, whether or not you do whole group instruction, small group instruction, partnerships, or individual work. And then you also want to review any essential vocabulary terms before students enter the museum and make sure that they are well versed in those terms as they move throughout the exhibit. And then last but not least, you want to make sure that you provide some sort of hands-on learning opportunity for them as they make their way through the museum. So that could be a passport or some sort of worksheet or graphic organizer or even a scavenger hunt. And so here's my example here. I chose a very specific exhibit in the Civil and Human Rights Museum that specifically discusses the civil rights movement only. And I chose to have my students work in partnerships. I gave them some essential vocabulary terms that they would need to move through the museum. And then students are actually going to create a interactive timeline using Google Slides, using the different materials that they find in the museum. So that's pictures, maybe quotes, or even just informational plaques. And so now it's your turn. So we're going to pause again, and I want you to go ahead and complete the following sections of your lesson plan template. So the first thing you need to do within your museum is pick an exhibit, and then decide how students will work together. Select at least 5 vocabulary terms related to the topic or standard that learners should know to be able to move through the museum. And then last but not least, research and select an engaging hands-on activity for learners to complete. Once you've completed this section of the lesson plan template, feel free to unpause the video and move on to the next slide. All right, welcome back. So, as students move through the museum, you want to find a way to assess student learning to make sure that that learning that we've planned for is actually taking place. It is absolutely critical to learners being engaged and their ability to retain information. When you assess students, you can see whether or not they are catching on to material, or maybe they need to be pushed a little bit further ahead because this is rather simple for them, or maybe you need to go back and reiterate a few things so that they are able to meet their learning target. And assessments are great for providing the necessary feedback to put those plans into motion. And so some examples of assessments can be questions. You can review student work as they move through the different exhibits. You can engage in discussions. Maybe there's some sort of electronic activity, or maybe they have to complete a specific task. And so all of these are really good ways to see if students are understanding what is being taught. And so here's my example here. I said that once students complete their interactive timeline, they're actually going to complete a Blue Kid quiz at the end of the exhibit to let me know whether or not they truly understood the concepts. And so now it's your turn. We're going to pause again, and I want you to go ahead and complete the assessment section of your lesson plan template. And so essentially you need to figure out how will learners show that they have mastered the material. Once you've completed this section, feel free to hit play on the video and move on to the next slide. The last part of our lesson plan covers reviewing and extending student learning. It's very important to review the main concepts because museums, again, can be very large and contain a lot of information. Students will spend, maybe anywhere from 1 to 3 hours absorbing information. And so you want to make sure that students understand the main point. Additionally, you also want to provide an extension opportunity for students so that they can take their learning beyond the museum. And so some examples could be a DIY home history exhibit. Students could also complete a service learning project. They could possibly take a summative assessment, so an exam of some sort, or they can complete a multimedia project. And these are just some of the examples of ways that you can extend museum learning beyond the museum walls. And so here's my example here. I said that in order to summarize, I was going to grab the group back together, and students will actually engage in a group discussion related to the content by answering those 4 higher order thinking questions I posed earlier. And you can do that by having students answer those individually and then discuss in groups, or be specific in calling on every student to at least answer one of the 4 questions. And then as far as extensions go, I said that students should interview an adult in the Atlanta area who was alive during the height of the civil rights movement and who can remember it, and then compare and contrast that story with the information that we typically read and see. Okay, so now it's your turn to complete the review and extension sections of your lesson plan. So you'll need to come up with some sort of way to review. Again, you can do a discussion or a formative activity, and then find a way for visitors, aka our learners, to incorporate those skills that they've learned and information beyond the museum field trip. Once you are done with that portion of your lesson plan, feel free again to hit play on the video, and then we will move into our own review session. So we've reached the end of my presentation. I just want to cover a few things with you before we go. Remember that museums can serve as a wonderful opportunity to create a historical learning opportunity for our students through structured learning. In order to create that structured learning, there's going to be some element of careful planning involved, including the lesson plan foundation. So that's where you go back and look at those standards and those learning targets and planning the visit to a museum that falls within that standard so that students have one area to focus on. And then, of course, you also want to make sure that you, as a historian, brush up on your vocabulary and then also incorporate vocabulary for the students to learn. The next thing you want to focus on again is developing those higher order thinking questions so that students can engage with the material in an analytical way or even a way that allows them to synthesize the information. You want to have students engaging in some sort of activity as they walk throughout the museum. You want to make sure that you review whatever it is that was covered during the museum visit. And then last but not least, provide an opportunity for students to extend their thinking. Thank you all for attending my presentation today. I hope that this has helped you figure out how to prepare a lesson plan for your next history museum visit. If you have any questions or comments or concerns, go ahead and send me an email to sdanderson9@liberty.edu and I will get back to you to help clarify any questions you might have. I want to again thank you all so much for attending my presentation. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.